know there's like been a surge of popularity for it, I think, because of people making money off of Top Shot, like all these crypto markets, like kind of like when Bitcoin got big, then Ethereum and some of the other ones rode along with it. I think that's sort of the principle for these, but I couldn't care less about owning Riot. Actually, no, that's not true. I could care slightly less.
Like, you want a Hadouken.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would honestly, if I could make my look wearing like a red headband and throwing fireballs, like if I could, I would trade money time in a heartbeat. What is up, guys? It's time for the L3S, the late slate sweat and swap, where we're going to be sweating and swapping all over all of our lineups and also talking about the night slate. And in addition to a nice little showdown tournament today, or a bunch of them, I guess, across the industry with Denver and Portland. But we'll talk about that in a second here. And I'm Chris Spags, joined by a man who, quite frankly, I don't see enough of these days. He's nerd-ass Greg Ehrenberg. How you doing, Greg?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's good we've got the late show because there was a couple of weeks. Well, you know, at first, at the start of the basketball season, we were doing shows together 5 days a week. Mm-hmm. Then we got separated a little bit, and then we got the late shows starting back up. So now we just hang out really like around dinner time, your time. But for me, you know, we're going to like almost midnight my time.
You know, we got to do like swingers. We got to switch it up sometimes to keep the romance in the relationship. But that's where you guys come in too, as the third party to my and Greg, this uncomfortable analogy that I'm making right now. So smash that like button right now and help us just feel like we're well respected, I think is the main thing, because that's something that perhaps our lineups aren't doing for us right now. And Greg is always on this show. We do talk about the late slate. We talk about the swap optimizing, all those things. But first, give me your thoughts on this slate, where I got to say, you know, like as it was happening, as some things were moving around during the show I was doing with Terry today on Live Before Lock, I felt like my grasp was getting looser as it went. And as the days gone on, John Collins concussed, thankfully didn't hurt a ton of lineups, but even with Collins out, Gallo's been bad, Vooch was bad, Embiid was bad. People were thinking Jarrett Allen was going to break the slate. He leveled out, kind of just having a perfectly fine day. The Mavs centers being crap, and then Boban coming in, having the best day out of all of them so far. These are all the items that we've seen so far. Dennis Smith also being competent, but what got you tilted, if anything, the most, Greg?
Yeah, so it's kind of weird because I'm doing really well on FanDuel and very poorly on DraftKings right now, mostly because I didn't have exposure to the Maverick centers really on FanDuel. I have like Willie Cauley-Stein and Dwight Powell each like 5% or something like that. But then DraftKings, because we're both more close to min price, I got to him a decent amount. And it was a thing too, where when we saw that James Johnson was starting, I was like, oh, well, I knew that there was another guy who's going to soak up minutes. I didn't even think about the Boban angle at that point, but I was just like, all right, there's another guy in the front court that's going to get minutes now. So I had to decrease them. But at that point already, the Pistons game had already locked. So I couldn't get to more of Dennis Smith Jr. I couldn't get to more of Saban Lee or anything like that. So there just wasn't very many other value plays to swap to. And I was already pretty locked on to. I wanted to play a lot of Harden and Giannis and Kyrie Irving, and then kind of go like stars and scrubs. And I just ended up on more of the Mavericks big men than I would have liked to. And I don't know what's going on now if the second half started, but that was going pretty poorly in the first half, at least.
Yeah, I have so much ownership tied up in Damian Lillard in the late game that I honestly don't even know like where I stand yet, because Damian Lillard, I think, can cover up some of the warts of my lineups. But overall, I had one move that I made here, and I guess we could talk about this sort of holistically with, you know, approaching slates and all of that and how things change. And Gallo's still at 6.5 points, even though John Collins is concussed. Just makes me so sad. But besides that, though, I had mentioned on Live Before Lock that I got a lot of Aaron Baines today because it seemed like the pivot that my sorting process on Excel would guide you away from Dwight Powell, guide me away from Willie Cauley-Stein, who, as we mentioned, lost minutes to Boban. Powell, I guess, also sort of lost minutes to Boban, but really I think Powell's minutes are more coming down because of the back-to-back and his recovery from injury and all that stuff. But that ended up being the right move, as if I should have played Baines over Powell by a wide margin, and that was what I had. And then I saw that Baines wasn't starting, and I was like, well, I can't play this guy now. And that's a play that I think is going to end up maybe not being super costly. It's not like Baines is breaking the slate mighty stretch, but it is one of those cases where you get the news and then you pivot off of something because a guy isn't starting. And I guess I should have been more secure in Baines' minutes. I don't know what the takeaway is, other than the fact that I feel silly for just being like, yeah, let me just global swap away from this guy. And now all of a sudden it's like, oh, cool, that would have actually been very helpful to get away from the field.
So something else I did on DraftKings that hurt me was I set a rule in Fantasy Cruncher to not play Saban Lee and Dennis Smith Jr. in the same lineups. And I actually liked Dennis Smith Jr. a decent amount for this slate. I thought it didn't make any sense to me. And our ownership changed a little bit as we got closer to lock, but at least earlier when I did the tip-off show, Dennis Smith Jr. is projected for 0.1% ownership. I was like, well, this guy just went from 70% owned to 0.1% owned with no change at all in what his outlook should be. Just he played one game and his minutes were poor. So I think I had 20% of Dennis Smith Jr. on DraftKings and then 30% Saban league, but I set it up so that I didn't have them together. And if I would have had them together, I would have gotten a little bit more exposure to both of them. And I would have had more live lineups just because both of them are playing really well.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I felt like, making a group for them would have made sense. And I actually did make two groups today. One was for the Dallas big men, of course, not including Boban, because you can't ever predict when Boban's going to play. That's just one of the fun things of Rick Carlisle, where he'll dust off Boban when you least expect him. And I guess that's today going in the second unit going against Robert Williams, which seemed like an odd move, but neither here nor there. I agree with you. Like Dennis Smith, I talked about it on Live Before Lock, where just the old DFS adage of when a chalk play busts and he still gets the same opportunity, same minutes, similar price, coming up the next game, is playing that guy more often than not is going to be a positive move. And I just couldn't get there projection wise. And it's one of those things that happened yesterday. I talked about with EMAC with David Nwaba, where I saw something data wise. I was like, oh, this is interesting, but the projection wasn't quite good enough. And sometimes it's just, this is why we say, we'll give you guys the best plays. We'll talk about Awesemo's projections, the guys that are the best values. But sometimes if you have that lean or that gut instinct and you just trust, the process of everything overall and how you're looking at a slate, it can, be important for getting the Dennis Smiths back in your life. Even if Saban Lee outperforms him today, like Smith at least was salvageable and only 3% owned. And if he did spike a major upside day, which wouldn't have been crazy, like he would be a slate breaker.
Yeah, and so the other thing about Dennis Smith is, I'm just going to pull up his numbers right now. I think he has like almost 30 fantasy points, but he's done it in 18 minutes. So, I think that I just kind of lucked into him anyway. Like if I knew he was playing 18 minutes, I'd be like, well, that's a crap play anyway. He just happened to play really well in those minutes. But going forward, I think it's going to be a really wonky situation now, right? Because I just think Dennis Smith and Saban Lee are going to split the point guard minutes, and it's going to be really hard to differentiate between the two. And overall, I don't think either of them are great points per minute fantasy producers. I just figured that one of them was going to end up playing well enough to take the majority of the point guard minutes today. And instead, they just kind of both played well, and they're splitting the minutes. So I don't know. It's probably a situation going forward. I'm going to stay away from, even though it seems like it's going to work out today for both of them.
Yeah, it does feel a bit like the previous Elfrid Payton, Emmanuel Quickley situation for New York, where you're going to see the hot hand. They also seem to want to play the rookie, and then maybe you see things level out, which has happened in New York, where Elfrid Payton's kind of reclaimed his role. Quickly made enough mistakes, I guess, to get buried down a little further down the bench. But also having Derrick Rose in the mix doesn't help. But yeah, that's how it goes. Brad Levine, one of our regulars here, so I appreciate Brad saying Spags got a fire call on Harrell at captain last night. I am actually, fun fact, playing more Showdown today because our marketing guy, Joey Corman, was texting me or slacking me earlier about Showdowns generally, and I guess he's been having some success. And I also basically bailed out my day yesterday, or at least helped out the end results a little bit more by having a nice showdown with the Lakers. And Greg, today we actually have a pretty good showdown with Portland and Denver as the main one there, in addition to a regular late slate. So I'm just going to ask you, no shame if you're not doing it, because we are doing a show, but are you playing the showdown too, or are you just playing the late slate?
I'm not. And it's actually funny because every other late slate show that we've done, I've actually just thrown in one showdown lineup just on the off chance because we don't even end up talking about it. But sometimes, we're a little short on time. We have other topics, people ask questions about it, and we start getting into it. And I usually build one lineup for it just because of that. And then today I didn't, because I was doing the other show, and then I had some other stuff I had to go do. I had to run to the pharmacy before and pick up some stuff, and then eating dinner, and I just didn't have time to get to everything. And this is literally like the only day we have it, and now we're talking about it apparently. But I do have a dummy built in here.
Yeah, I just the tournament appealed to me a little bit more than the actual late slate, because honestly, tonight's late slate, I think the Lou Williams absence, actually, I didn't update the minutes because they weren't updated when I was last looking on Awesemo, but I'm sure, they just came in 1 minute ago. So Lou Williams out for the actual late slate itself. And I guess let's talk about the swaptimizing part of things, because this can be something you do to try to bail out some dead lineups. And for me, one thing that I will not be doing actually is swaptimizing off of Damian Lillard. I mentioned it earlier that I had him at 80% of my lineups. So I was expecting to be about, I guess, 6x the field on the 12% that was projected for him, depending on how that looks. And I'm going to keep Lillard in there because I think he's my best shot at a bailout. But Greg, is there anybody here who you think has gained some opportunity or some interest for you, or just could be a Hail Mary play at low ownership that people maybe could swap to if they somehow have the real estate or the, I guess, if you have like Jokic somewhere that's swappable, like what would you do if you could to try to bail out some of the bad chalk out there?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm so exposed to the early games. Like the only player I really have exposure to from these late games is well, Jokic, some exposure on DraftKings and FanDuel, and then Michael Porter Jr. for the millionth time. I'm sure that's going to go poorly anyway. Like I mean, like I'm fine with sticking with Michael Porter Jr. But I don't think there's anything I would swap to that I would look at least in the way that my lineups are built, and think like, oh, this is something I really want to get to. From the Clippers side, if I had to pick one value play, I think Patrick Beverly is marginally interesting now for the full slate. He's going to have no ownership on the full slate for FanDuel and DraftKings. And if people have the flexibility to swap to him, I wouldn't go leave a massive amount of salary on the table or anything. But Patrick Beverly could play significant minutes today. His last 3 games, his minutes have been trending up 23, 25, and 28 minutes. And now we unexpectedly have Lou Williams ruled out. So it's possible that we see around 30 minutes from Patrick Beverly, and that would make him a pretty good value at his current price on both FanDuel and DraftKings. He is 4,500 on both sites.
Yeah, with Lou Williams being ruled out, and it's a rest day for him apparently, so I guess he didn't want to run too much against Washington today. Who knows? But Patrick Beverly now projected for 28 minutes by Awesemo, so that gives him about a 5x value, and I guess that's important because in this game overall, Greg, the Washington Clippers game, I don't see anybody I'd really want to play. Like Avdia, I think is vaguely interesting in the hopes that the Clippers run away with this one. It is a game with an 11, actually, no, it's an 11-point spread. I think it was a little bit more earlier, but 11-point spread in this game, Washington on the back-to-back and LA night. And we do have some nightlife open here in LA now. It's definitely some underground nightlife has been open, spreading COVID all over the place. And I'm sure some of the Washington Wizards enjoyed their time out here as much as one can. But really the pricing here for the Wizards, I don't see anything I like at all, like on their side. I mean, Avdi, I think you make a case for. Robin Lopez, I think you make a case for with him having lately been up around high 20s minutes. Mo Wagner, even when he plays a little bit more, plays more competently, it does seem like Lopez is the guy they're really getting to. But anybody for Washington jump out to you at all? Because Alex has a good projection on Westbrook and Beal. I just don't see it quite as much for me.
So there's a difference in salary on Russell Westbrook between DraftKings and FanDuel. Westbrook is 9,800 on DK, 9,200 on FanDuel. He's not somebody I got to on this slate, but if you're looking to maybe bail out a lineup and maybe you have Damon and you want to swap to Westbrook and then pay up somewhere else, like I think it's feasible to think that Westbrook has a really big game. He's playing really well over the last handful of games, and the Wizards are playing well also. The Wizards have won, 4 or 5 in a row now. But the one thing that I have the most concern about Westbrook, this is only the second back-to-back he's played the entire season. He played 44 minutes in that overtime game yesterday. Are the Wizards really going to be willing to play Westbrook and Beal massive minutes, especially in a game where it's a 12.5-point spread? Like if they're down really big at some point in the second half, like I could see them pulling the plug early. So I think there's upside in Westbrook. He's the player on the Wizards that has the most potential to have a big game relative to his salary, but still not somebody that I'm all that interested in.
Yeah, I mean, overall, it just doesn't look the most appealing here. The implied total of 111.8 feels like there should be a bit more, but I just, Westbrook on the back-to-back, I think he's playing, which is a positive thing, but a 35-minute projection that that Awesemo has from him feels a little aggressive. I think certainly a tournament play, these guys will not be unowned for the night slate. And also anybody who's looking for the ownership projections, usually they get them out during the show. So have no fear. I mean, they always get them out during the show, just unclear what time, and might be waiting to see if there's any other news. So have no fear. They will get updated before lock, usually with ample time before lock too, but it hasn't been reflected yet. The Clippers side, I think Beverly, like you said before, as a value play looks interesting. Besides that, I really find it hard to get to Paul George. Kawhi Leonard, I think, is the only appealing play here. Playing against the Clippers in a pace-up spot, it does seem like if they do run away with this game, that it could come largely at the hands of Kawhi. But do you have any feel for Kawhi or Paul George, or I guess any Clippers who aren't Patrick Beverly?
No, well, so first let's clarify also, we're talking about in terms of making swaps for the main slate, because this is the swap spit and whatever other S words we could throw in there that we do for this part of the show, is for the main slate. Like I didn't get any exposure to the Clippers guys. I didn't get any exposure to the Wizards guys. For the late slate, obviously it's going to be different because we only have 2 games to talk about, and then everybody's in play basically, and then we just talk about which guys we like the most. But as far as it pertains to the main slate, yeah, I don't really like Kawhi Leonard or Paul George that much either. We've seen in general the Clippers be fairly cautious with these guys' minutes workloads, And with the spread for this game being so wide, I think this is a game where the Wizards starters come out early. And then if the Wizards starters come out early, like I don't think that the Clippers are just going to say like, hey, let's leave Kawhi Leonard out here to play 35 minutes, because if it's a game where they're up by double digits in the fourth quarter and the Wizards wave the white flag, then I expect the Clippers will follow suit.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So, and then again, tough to swap probably to Kawhi or really any of the Clippers besides Patrick Beverly. But Patrick Beverly too, it's not like it's a slam dunk projection by, damn it. I got to stop saying that.
We're bringing it back.
I don't know why all of a sudden, years doing these shows, and all of a sudden I'm just like a cliche local sports anchor, just like, yeah, it's a chest pass of, I don't know. Either way, Patrick Beverly, I feel like maybe the one swap play you could make in the hopes of, if you had two spots, I feel like going to Beverly makes more sense, or maybe you free up some money and can get to a Kawhi, if you really want to get weird, get to a Westbrook or Beal, but seems like narrow margins. In the later games to swap around, again, if there's any way to get to Lillard for anybody out there, I don't know why there would be if you're playing this game, but I think moving to him instead of a Jokic, I would consider doing that. Moving to him, if you somehow can move away from Jamal Murray, I think I would do that. I just very much am a believer on Lillard on the slate, or in Lillard on the slate. And Cancer, I think, is a fine play, though his price on DraftKings doesn't put me there much. So I don't see much to swap to on the Portland side, besides if somebody out there could swap to Lillard besides me and the heavy footprint I had for him already. But anything about Portland seems swappable to you, Greg?
No, but I'm just thinking now about how we have to have like dumb bit for the late night show. It's like, here's the slam dunk play of the day. Here's the turnover play, right? Like this is the chalk play most likely to bust. That's the turnover play. Then we've got the fundamental, just the chalk play that we think is safe. I mean, there's all kinds of, the 3-pointer, the guy with the most upside. We'll call it there's all kinds of ways we could go with your stupid faux pas here.
It's just, I don't know why it's all of a sudden, like, it feels like something that somebody would be doing deliberately, like the local news, people in the YouTube chat, so text saying, boom goes the dynamite. Yeah, I guess that's basically where I am, doing a local access TV sports radio and making slam dunk jokes. But tell me about Portland, though. Anybody here that you find to be swappable or achievable in some way?
Yeah, the man passes the ball to the man, he shoots, and boom goes the dynamite.
High energy too, that kid was.
I've never seen somebody more nervous to be on camera before.
I guess you haven't. Actually, I'm trying to think I can't even think of who to make fun of here, though. I did hear Eric doing some of his fun voices today with you on the tip off. So I feel like that maybe that counts.
Yeah, I don't enjoy that very much. I love Eric, but I've told him before, I don't like that very much.
Portland you don't like the silly voices, Greg?
Portland. I have to recap now and look over all the guys that are here now. I just don't understand, like, who would you be getting to that you would be swapping off of at this point in time? So, like, I mean, if you roster Damian Lillard, right? Like, I mean, you're on Damian Lillard. There's no real reasonable pivot. Like I said, you could go down to Westbrook, but I don't really think that makes sense. Robert Covington is way too expensive for me on both FanDuel and DraftKings. I thought there was a million better center options than Enes Kanter. And with that said, most of the center options I liked have already played and they're going poorly, with the exception being Jared Allen. But yeah, my center options are taken up, so I'm not rostering him. Gary Trent, I think, is a somewhat viable play, but also I don't know who you'd be swapping off of him for. So nothing here really makes a whole lot of sense. If people have questions or like, hey, I specifically rostered this guy and I'm thinking about swapping to that guy, maybe that's the way that we could approach this. But or else there's nothing in my lineups that I swap to. Is there anything that you actually swap to from any of these teams?
No, I mean, again, I'm just digging my heels in on Damian Lillard because that was a low on play and that was sort of the construction that I deliberately built around today. So for me, swapping off of that doesn't make any sense. I agree going to Trent. Like, I guess the thing is, really, you have to have a 2v2 at this point, and maybe it's unlikely to do it because if you have a 2v2, you probably have like Lillard and Jokic, and at that point, what are you going to do? Give up the very easy raw points projection for Lillard or Jokic there, and then go down to some guys who are going to be probably equally owned? Or I agree, like, there isn't a lot to swap to here. I guess the one guy I could see swapping to if you had a 2v2 where you had some money to go around, let's say you had trying to think, Lillard and cheap power forward X, and then you went to Porter Jr. and like Westbrook or Beal. I think swapping to Porter Jr. right now, I think is the only move that I could see making. And it's really more knowing how bad Porter Jr. has been and how, the minutes being sucked away from him, even when he's, performing adequately on a per minute basis. Like, I think trying to target a Porter Jr. day here and hope that he sort of somehow has one of those high ceiling days. I know, Greg, that you're not somebody was mad at you during the tip off for saying those days don't come anymore for Michael Porter Jr., but he's still very much capable of having an outlier day. And even though I agree with you that they haven't happened very much recently, I feel like maybe swapping to Porter Jr. is the one swap I could see making if you had a 2v2.
Well, to be clear, I mean, I said that I had about 30% exposure to him also during the show. I just said I had no confidence in it. I said the range of outcomes is so wide that if he was just 5,700, like, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago or something, as he was at the time, he would have been like my highest owned small forward on most slates. And even though he's one of my higher owned small forwards, I had less exposure than I would have normally just because I had so little confidence in his minutes. But yeah, I mean, as a play, it's not like I was fading Michael Porter Jr. today. I was unhappily playing him.
No, that's fair. I'm merely referencing the show earlier because there was one guy who I think previously was mad at both of us yesterday for some reason. And I forget why. I for some reason, like people with like a particular avatar who are angry, I remember more vividly than others. And I was like, oh, this guy's mad at Greg now on this show. He just won't leave us alone, just cyberbullying us left and right for Michael Porter Jr. takes, which are fairly well founded.
Yeah, and I mean, Michael Porter Jr. has had, I don't know, 8 bad games in a row or something like that now. He's going to have a good one eventually, and there is no sunk cost with me. I'm going down with the Michael Porter Jr. ship. He's going to make it into my lineups no matter what until he has a good game. Because at this point, because I'm always going to project him well. It's just a matter of a couple of things keep happening with him alternating. Either he plays poorly on defense and gets yanked and plays like 20 minutes, or he goes like 0 of 8 from the field, and like I can't project he's going to make 0% of his shots in any given day. So there's just been a bunch of really odd circumstances that have made it so that he hasn't played well from a fantasy standpoint. I even think there was one game where he actually was playing reasonably well. Oh, it was the game against the Cavs 2 games ago. He's playing well. He scores. He shoots 8 of 16 from the field, scores 22 points. And then the Nuggets win by 17 points, and he doesn't get to play in the fourth quarter. So there have been other circumstances too that have prevented him from having good games when he should. And I mean, he's still a really talented offensive player and overall a good points per minute fantasy producer for the year. So he's going to have a good game eventually. I hope it's tonight.
I hope so too. I'm going to be there pretty heavy for the late slate and the showdown. Michael Porter Jr., was a guy on the main slate today I didn't feel the need to get to a ton of, but I do think over under one of our regulars in the chat saying never MPJ. And first of all, I feel like we talk about these things a lot. There should never be a never anybody for your DFS life. Like that's just not the most plus EV way to live for the most part, especially in DFS where, I guess if you're a single entry guy every single day and you go like, I'm not going to play Michael Porter Jr., then I guess maybe that's achievable in some way. But even if you're doing like a max 20 or a 3 max, at some point you just got to be willing to let a guy like Porter Jr. in because he has been, as Greg mentioned, a little bit unlucky with the minutes, getting the classic Michael Malone treatment where last game he lost minutes to some of the guards. Also, then the game was kind of out of hand. The second unit was looking better, so they kept the second unit in. There's going to be a day where it does align for Porter Jr. and he maybe seizes back some of the usage from Jamal Murray, who's been admittedly shooting the ball a lot more recently over the last couple of weeks. He's had a 29% usage rate and actually been cutting into both Jokic and Michael Porter Jr. appreciably. But I feel like just going to Porter Jr. tonight, the main slate too, having some exposure there, which I do, I feel like just keep targeting Michael Porter Jr. for now, even though he sucks, because that's sort of what DFS is trying to catch the bounce back day, especially on a day if he does have, the 50-point ceiling he's shown in the past. If he could do that on a day where he's going to be low owned because everybody's like, no, I can't do it again. Like that is how you actually win a tournament.
It's funny. Michael Porter Jr. So in the bubble, so we're talking about, I don't know, what was that 6 months ago, 7 months ago? Michael Porter Jr. was a chalk play at 8,000, and now he's 5,700, and nobody wants to play him. It's just funny how the players move, almost like how they're stocks, and we still see people who, when people are at their bottom, nobody wants anything to do with him. But then all of a sudden, it's like Clint Capella's 11,000. It was like, I got to roster him because he had 2 good games in a row, and generally, you kind of want to play guys coming off of bad games as much as people aren't happy with that.
And it's a little bit different for Porter Jr., I think, because the price has been coming up on him too, even though he has had these bad days because he's been rostered pretty heavily from time to time. But I'm still willing to be there. He's still a guy that projects pretty much anywhere you would look for over a 5x value. And on the night slate in particular, like there really aren't a lot of guys who even project over 5x. And that's sort of an antiquated projection mechanism for trying to judge which plays are going to be good. But on it's still a reflection for the most part on a slate and the opportunity that some of these guys have. and where you really don't have a lot of guys in that range. Like I think Barton projects pretty well, but still on raw points, I would have Porter Jr. Like I think you just got to kind of hold your nose and play Porter Jr. for the night slate, even if you didn't play him on the main slate.
Yeah, and I mean, if I liked him for the 9-game slate, if I have exposure to him on a 9-game slate, then I definitely think it makes sense to get exposure to him on a 2-game slate.
We also got the starters for Denver. It's Murray, Morris, Barton, Jokic, and Michael Porter Jr. So that is a 5 there. And Monty Morris, I guess, getting some more secure minutes, which is Michael Green, Paul Millsap still out for Denver. Gary Harris as well, still out. Monty Morris, I feel like if you bump his minutes up a little bit more, and accounting for the fact, too, that people do tend to pay a little bit less attention for some of the night slates, I think Monty Morris actually kind of live now as a play that just won't be as owned as he should be for a guy who's starting and probably like he did last game, probably seeing around 30 minutes.
Yeah, I'm just bringing up his numbers really quickly when he's been in the starting lineup this year.
They dropped quite a bit. Like his usage goes down, his assists go down, but just the sheer volume of minutes I feel like would be the main thing for him.
He's played fairly well as a starter this year, actually. 34 minutes per game, averaging 29.75 DraftKings points. I mean, that's pretty good. That's pretty good.
It's his splits if you run the splits with Jokic and Murray, like his usage goes down to like 12%, but like because the starter minutes still include him being a little more productive, like in the second units, I think. So that's like overall, it probably looks better than if you just look like on NBA Wowie and just try to gauge how Morris looks when he's playing alongside the stars.
So the big difference in terms of his production is that he's playing 34 minutes per game as a starter as opposed to 25 and a half minutes as a reserve. So, I mean, you give him all those extra minutes and it's hard for him to not look fairly strong as a fantasy play. So, what's funny is actually, so we were talking earlier about guys who'd be willing to swap to. If you have flexibility, I think Monty Morris would be somebody you could swap to for the full slate.
Yeah, I think that's fair. The price isn't fantastic. Like it'd be great if we had a 3K range. Monty Morris, he's certainly priced for his usual opportunity, but he does assist well. This is, Portland team that gives up a lot of production. So definitely some ways that Morris can either get more assists or score a little bit more himself. Just get some open looks potentially. So yeah, I think Morris to me, a much better night slate play now, and also a play that actually could be worth a little bit for those main slates. Would you consider Jokic a priority here for, I guess, well, we can't swap to Jokic for the most part, but would Jokic be a priority play for you on the night slate?
Yeah, especially because we're not really lacking in value, right? I mean, relative to a 2-game slate, I think we have a bunch of guys on the cheaper end, like Patrick Beverly. He opens up now, at least for the later slate. Anthony Simons has been playing at least enough minutes to be viable. You mentioned Denny as somebody who thought was a decent cheap option for the Wizards. And something else I like about Denny is he's going to be in the Wizards rotation. And then I know we don't necessarily predict blowouts, but if there's a game that's going to be likely to be a blowout, it's the Wizards. It's 12.5-point underdogs on the road against the Los Angeles Clippers, playing on the tail end of a back-to-back in a game where not only could it potentially be one-sided as the spread suggests, except also a game where due to them playing in an overtime game last night, I think they could take their starters out early in this game. So Denny is somebody who's going to be in the rotation normally and then probably plays in the fourth quarter no matter what the score of the game is.
So here's a big question here, and we'll give you guys some ownership previews as well. Just hit the like button now. Get as many likes in as you can. We got about 415 people in here, and we appreciate all you guys tuning in, but get us at least over 125 likes. Give us a little self-respect, and we'll give you guys the current projected top 5 owned plays on DraftKings and FanDuel, which just got updated 5 minutes ago. So our hardworking CEO doing everything behind the scenes here, doing some ownership projections at night for you guys. So hit that like button now, and we'll give you guys a little bit look at that. But Zeke Nnaji not starting now. He was going to be a preeminently owned value play, and now it seems like he's taking a big drop down. And Greg, just given the price here and the fact that Zeke's minutes are certainly going to be more insecure, but he will also be in a lower usage group, so that can be a little bit of a plus sometimes depending on the player. Not sure that matters too much for a guy like Zeke who doesn't shoot too much, but would you cut your Zeke Nnaji exposure out entirely given the fact that he's not starting?
Not entirely, because I still think he's going to get some minutes, but he's definitely a low priority play at this point. If this was even a 3-game night slate, then yes, probably. But since it's only 2 games, I still think that he's okay. Although only on DraftKings, not on FanDuel. For the season, Zeke's numbers, I mean, we have seen him come off the bench and play decent minutes at times. Before starting last game, he had a couple of games where we didn't play a ton, but that was also when they had Michael Green healthy and some other guys available. Games before that, February 16th against Boston, he played 27 minutes. February 14th against the Lakers, he played 24 minutes. So I still think that it's reasonable to think we get somewhere in the neighborhood of, like 24-ish minutes from him. And on a 2-game slate, I think that makes him okay considering his price tag on DraftKings, but low priority. I'd actually rather roster RJ Hampton if I'm honest.
Interesting. So let's talk about that, because RJ Hampton to me looked like a pretty solid value for the showdown slates, but also one that does project as a solid value. So he should find his way to some more ownership than perhaps possibly more than he should relative to showdowns. But RJ Hampton, I'm also just putting in the projections update. If you are a premium member at Awesemo, we did just get a projections update, not just the ownership projections, but the actual one. So if you want to pull in that data, you can do that now. And let me just see, Nnaji now projected for 19.6 minutes, and Monty Morris now projected for 30 flat. So those are pretty big changes here that I'm gonna have to account for. And we also hit the like number, so I'll give you guys the ownership in a second. But yeah, Nnaji, Hampton, Harkenstein. I guess we could talk a little showdown here, Greg, but those guys look like the top value plays, or at least did recently for, according to Awesemo's projections. In terms of the cheap values, who would you want some exposure to? Who would you rule out? And let's say that it is still looking like it'll be Hood, Hampton, and Harkenstein are now the obvious top values.
So I'm going to make a case for some of the cheaper guards from the Nuggets. So considering that the Nuggets are now starting Monty Morris instead of Nnaji, I think we're going to see smaller lineups from them, and we're going to see them trend more towards playing the guards. So I think that we have to expect that Nnaji plays less minutes. And I think Hartenstein plays less minutes. And instead, there's more of a priority to get Hampton some minutes, to get Monty Morris obviously minutes because he's starting. And then also Campazzo. I think that he benefits from this a little bit also. Even though some of those guys, Hampton and Campazzo, aren't starting, I just have to look at that starting lineup and assume that the Nuggets are going to trend towards playing smaller.
No, I think that's actually a good way to look at it too. And maybe that also gives you a little bit more interest in like the Anthony Simons of the world, because I guess that does clear a pathway here where you don't maybe have to have the Derek Jones in the mix, or, one of these guys. It's an interesting way to talk about it, but let's get the ownership out there, because you guys did hit the like threshold. We appreciate it a bunch, and always come back here because we're doing the show every day. In the middle of the week here, you get me and Greg 3 days in a row on the night slate. A joy for me, a joy for Greg too, doing it late on the East Coast. So we're here for you guys, and just come back tomorrow, come back every day, because we're doing it all the time around here. Let me get the ownership back up. It's money time. Thank you, Tyler, for reminding me of that too. Too many things that I sometimes forget to flip my hat. It's the nature of my life and my drug-addled brain. Number one, though, for the night slate, Nikola Jokic, 45% rounded up on DraftKings. Number two, Kawhi Leonard, 41% rounded up. Number three, Damian Lillard at 40%. He should not be that low. Number four, Russell Westbrook at 35%. And number five, rounding out a group of stars here on DraftKings, 33% for Bradley Beal. On FanDuel, number one, Paul George. Number two, at 60%. Number two, Nikola Jokic, also at 60%. Number three, Bradley Beal at 52%. Number four, Gary Trent at 50%. And number five, Damian Lillard at 47%. Greg, FanDuel, let's talk about these guys fast. George, Jokic, Beal, Trent, and Lillard. Do any of them seem like they shouldn't be a top five? I know Paul George, the price there is a little more appealing, but I feel like moving away from Paul George at 3/4 of the field being on him, or just about, I don't mind that move at all.
Well, the thing is, then you look at the shooting guard options on FanDuel, and it's Bradley Beal, Paul George, Gary Trent, and that's kind of it. Like, the next option is Terrence Mann and Luke Kennard. So there's only three guys to look at as viable shooting guards on FanDuel, unless anybody feels way differently about Terrence Mann or Luke Kennard playing big minutes. Maybe you're playing them in a blowout situation where you're saying that, like, hey, I'm going to fade Paul George and Kawhi Leonard. I'm going to play Terrence Mann because I think that the Clippers just smashed the Wizards today. Other than that, I find it really hard to get away from Paul George, just given the other options.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I wouldn't mind going to a Beal and Trent grouping on FanDuel, but I get where you're going with that. And I think especially if you're playing multiples of lineups on there, you're definitely going to have some Paul George exposure, but it does seem like a lot for a guy who I think, if there were a blowout, I feel like he's the one that maybe the minutes don't quite get there. He could be productive in that court time leading to a blowout, but it's hard to project that stuff, but back-to-back big point spread, I think that is one thing that's a little bit hard to not talk about. I guess there is sort of the other side of the equation. I think it's something interesting to talk about with blowouts where There have been so many games this year where we've seen teams, be completely ruled out by the casual field for the most part. Like the Thunder Milwaukee game is one that comes to mind, where you then see these guys sort of play above their depth to get where they are. Is there any logic to you, Greg, in just like loading up on the Washington side in the hopes that they do keep it competitive and then maybe running it back with a Paul George or Kawhi? So you're getting the best of this game when a lot of people will probably favor the other game by a wide margin.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense to do that both ways, especially if you're building multiple lineups. And this is a type of lineup construction that doesn't make a whole lot of sense for a 9-game slate. But for a 2-game slate, yeah, I think it makes a whole lot of sense to just say like, hey, maybe this game's competitive. Blowouts are random, right? We haven't seen as much of them recently. Do you remember the beginning of the year when like every 9-game slate, like 6 of them would be decided by like 25 points? Yeah. And so, yeah, I think that there's reason to think that it's potential that Clippers Wizards is competitive, and maybe the Nuggets blow out the Blazers, and maybe it's all the studs from the other game that end up having the big games. And then I also think that there's reason to load up on Denver Portland, and then you just play bench guys from Clippers Wizards. They're not really bench guys, but like Terrence Mann, somebody who we wouldn't normally look at as a strong play, and just say like, hey, if I'm fading Kawhi Leonard and Paul George in a particular lineup, what is the game script that goes for neither of these guys to have a big game? And the most obvious one is the blowout. And then you start to look at the other players there and you start to script out the game. You say, all right, if it's a blowout and these guys don't play in the fourth quarter, who is going to play well from the Clippers? And that's where I'd probably look at Terrence Mann as the best play for that kind of situation. So yeah, I think that either way you could script lineups that follow that kind of game script. Did that all make sense? I feel like I just said a lot of words at once.
No, I think I get where you're going with that. And yeah, I think you can play, especially if you are putting in a lot of lineups here, for the most part, we talk about on the show when we're doing the show. And actually this is part of why I normally don't put in more than 2 lineups, because if I wanted to tinker with things while we're doing it, I don't have to worry too much about it. And today I went really aggressive on the showdown lineups. And now I'm just like, well, they all have Zeke Nnaji in them. So I don't know if this is still a good play, seeming like not so much. And I think RJ Hampton for me is going to be projected slightly better than Zeke, which doesn't make me feel great. But overall, I'm with you though. Like I think trying to get different with your configurations, if you are putting in a bunch of these, the projections are going to guide you to a similar path to a lot of people, because there's only so many ways you can go on a 2-game slate, especially where the projections for the most part for a lot of these guys aren't fantastic. So game stacking, trying to, tell, as we talk about a lot of these shows, and I think it's sort of a cliche thing to say now, telling a story with your lineups and all that, I think is going to be very important here. And the story of the Wizards somehow being competitive here, having another big day after they picked up kind of surprising win yesterday. I think that's certainly one narrative that'll be a little bit less owned overall.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, especially because the spread is so wide. Let me see, what is the ownership on some of those like crappy players from the Clippers who we would never play normally, but might play in a blowout situation? I don't have the most latest one in front of me, but I'm going to bring it up. What is the ownership for Terrence Mann?
He was actually, did I just paste this in? I think I did, but he was 14.5. Let me just double check, because I definitely
I have it in front of me now. So Terrence Mann is 24% on DraftKings, and he is 16% on FanDuel. So it's still somewhat popular. It's hard to find somebody who has no ownership on a 2-game slate, but I mean that's relatively low ownership considering how many games are considering the slate size.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point there. And wait, did I just pull the wrong ownership? Or did you pull the wrong ownership? No, because I think I have the recent one here. Yeah, Man's at 14.5 on DraftKings. So where are you getting? Are you looking at a showdown?
No, I'm
Is
just
there a showdown?
Oh, you know what? I clicked on the main slate. That's why.
Oh, there you go.
Let me go back. All right. So there we go. All right. Now I clicked on the right one. Here we go. All right. Here we go. Here it comes.
A Reggie Jackson at 7%, vaguely interesting too.
All right, yeah, Terrence Mann 14.5% on DraftKings, and then Terrence Mann is 15% on FanDuel. So yeah, I think those are reasonable ownerships. Now that I have the right one in front of me, is there anybody who's under 10% ownership that you think has actual legitimate upside?
So for this, to be clear, we're talking about the night slate. We will talk a little bit of showdown for Portland, Denver as well. So just to specify the ownerships that we're talking about here. But I think Reggie Jackson picking up some more of the usage here. Like everybody's going to be going to Beverly. I think that's going to be the logical play on a projection basis. But Reggie getting more usage in a second unit, I think like he and Kennard would be the ones that I'd be willing to take the leap of faith on. Though Kennard really, despite the fat contract he has, it feels like they just don't want to play him for whatever reason, or maybe it's a message sending thing. Who knows? I feel like Reggie's more secure, but overall, like Reggie and Kennard at similar price points. I think if you had a lineup construction that just had that 4,300 range as the last remaining spot, I feel like going to Reggie, going to Kennard, I think those would be the two.
Yeah, I'm just looking at other guys to see if there's anybody else that would make it in for me. RJ Hampton is above the imaginary threshold I set, so I've priced myself out of Hampton. But 12% for him, I think, is a viable play on DraftKings at the flat min, just because of what I said before about the Nuggets starting lineup. I assume that they're going to go to more guards in small ball, considering they're starting Monty Morris over Zeke Nnaji. So a little bit above the threshold. I really undercut you there because I said it has to be somebody sub 10% owned, and I let you go first. And then I went second and just went with somebody who's above 10%. But RJ Hampton, I think, is the guy that I would go with for low ownership.
Yeah, I get it. I get RJ Hampton. I think I'm thinking about it a little bit more through the showdown, where I think on the showdown, if I had to guess, RJ Hampton's going to be a little bit overowned because I think he's going to come up pretty fast in the optimizer. And actually, I'm looking at it now, and I may not swap off my Zeke Nnaji on the actual showdown slate because I think that there he still has value. Hampton, I think, is going to get more minutes based on the projections I'm seeing. So, or get more ownership rather on the projections I'm seeing. Yeah, I don't feel great about it because I think Greg's point here about them going small probably doesn't help Nnaji, but I think overall that I'd rather just get a guy who's a little bit less owned, going to be in that second unit, as we talk about a lot on these shows, where him being a starter clearly didn't benefit his usage, where he barely put up any fantasy points in 30 minutes of playing time last game. So maybe him being back in the second unit gives us some more shots or rebounds, some more actual shots. Like, I feel like I don't mind Nnaji now, though. On the night slate, he's still going to be 24% owned. I feel like probably moving away from him on the night slate itself rather than the showdown slate, I think, is still the move.
Yeah, and then let's bring up he's still pretty popular on the night slate. So yeah, it's going to be hard for me to justify playing him because, I mean, like you said before, I also have Hampton projected for more fantasy points than him at this point. So Zeke Nnaji, I think I agree with you based on ownership for the showdown slate. He's probably going to be more popular there, or Hampton's going to be more popular there. But then if you look at the main slate, Nnaji, at least as of now, still picking up ownership.
We got a question here on YouTube from Brian Seymour saying, what good prop bets do you guys see for the late slate that might be good? This is something worth checking out. We talk about it. You're probably going to hear it a lot more on Awesemo shows coming up. But there is a new feature on the Odds Shopper tool that we have at oddsshopper.awesemo.com, where you can see, all the lines here and the various bookmakers and all their data and all that. But you can also see Alex's projections for these guys and then figure out the best bets according to ROI or win percentage. And it does seem everybody's favorite, Michael Porter Jr. looks like the best bet on the board for over 13.5 points, a 73% chance of winning, a 31.9% ROI. And I think based on what we've talked about with people not, maybe not wanting Michael Porter Jr. in DFS, I think probably the same for betting markets too, where the over probably a little bit lower than it should be. And there actually are a lot of lines out there, 14.5. So if you can get him at 13.5, that does seem like it'd be the best bet of the night slate.
Yeah, and even with him struggling, I'm going to bring up right now what his recent point totals have been. So in the last 3 games, 10 points, 22 points, 14 points. So, I mean, he's still gone over the 13.5 mark in 2 of the last 3 games, even though he's totally sucked. Obviously, the game before that, he shot 0 of 8 from the field and then scored 0 points. That's not going to win any prop bets out there. But in general, we would expect a lot more points than 13.5 for Michael Porter Jr. He's averaging 13.9 for the season, but also remember that includes him coming back from COVID, playing limited minutes, coming off the bench. Now he's starting and playing bigger minutes as long as he doesn't totally suck on defense. So certainly the baseline for him is higher than 13.5 points, in my opinion. Yeah,
no, I agree. I would have him projected at so actually his points per game is 13.9. So that alone, I think, should give people some hope. I have him projected for 17.3 points, which feels aggressive and probably explains why I always get too much Michael Porter Jr. but boy, he would smash that bet. He scores 17.
We do have a super chat in here. Somebody asking, I could answer this one because he asked who is favorite power forward play on FanDuel, and I could open up my lineups right here, and the player who I have the most exposure to, although he's also the chalk at the position, is I'm going to answer this 2 different ways. So Serge Ibaka to me is the best overall power forward play. He's also the chalk, so you're not really differentiating yourself from the field at all. If you're going to somebody who's a little bit lower owned, around 30% for Davis Bertans, I think that's a sensible play for a couple of reasons. Number one, Bertans is still cheap. He's a very, very high variance player. Because he shoots a lot, and sometimes the shots fall, sometimes they don't. So last 4 games for Davis Bertans, 32 FanDuel points, 46, 12, and 14. So you're getting either most likely he's going to crush that salary price point or he's going to fall way short of it, which is something I like personally for GPPs. He's somebody who's either going to make or break the slate. The other thing also is if we look at the wide spread for this game, like the Wizards are definitely outgunned against the Clippers. And one of the ways that they're going to have to try to stay in the game, I think, is just the variance of 3-point shooting. And that's kind of where Davis Bertans goes in the mix. So I think we could see him play a couple extra minutes than normal, maybe take a couple extra shots just with the hopes of that's how the Wizards stay competitive against a better team.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable way to look at it. And yeah, I mean, really taking flyers on any of the Wizards guys for the most part. I talked about Avdia being a guy that I'm going to have some stabs on just because he's cheap enough. And there are a lot of ways that he gains minutes. But I think if we're looking at a build where Washington stays competitive, certainly setting up, Bertans for some shots. I guess the one cause for concern would be that the Clippers do give up a lot less than league average assisted threes. So I think taking a guy who can create his own threes has a little more upside potentially. And that's, the only guy who really could do that on the team is Bradley Beal. So if we're choosing between Bradley Beal and Davis Bertans, that's probably not a fair price comparison. But you know what, Greg, I'd favor Bradley Beal over Davis Bertans. Prove me wrong.
Yeah, I totally disagree with you. I think Bertans outscores the league's leading scorer tonight. if we're just gonna make baseless hot takes, so we could pretend we're Kendrick Perkins on ESPN, who just goes on TV and makes stuff up. Which, I mean, why not? You're there because you won one overrated championship a million years ago, and for some reason people think you're part of like one of the greatest teams of all time. So yeah, I mean, yeah, we'll just go up and make stuff up just for but yeah, Davis Bertans outscores Bradley Beal easily. Not even close. Not even worth talking about.
Our boy News God saying Bertans is play of the night. So there you go. That's now you can be mad at him if Bertans doesn't have a good day, just passing it all over the place. How long does it take Beverly to get Westbrook ejected? JJT asked in the YouTube chat. Probably, I mean, he's going to agitate him. They're certainly going to be chippy. And honestly, that it wouldn't shock me if that's sort of baked into the total here. Like an 11-point spread, the Wizards have been playing a little better. 11-point spread doesn't seem unreasonable, but maybe accounting for a Westbrook ejection early is part of the total here being such a wide gap between the two teams.
Well, although Westbrook and the Wizards played much better recently, but at least earlier in the year, Westbrook getting ejected probably have been a good thing for the Wizards because they were significantly better with him off the court earlier in the season. That's not the case anymore, though. Westbrook's played pretty well over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, he's definitely shown some signs of life. Let's talk a little bit about the showdown slate. And I think the showdown actually, it's weird. It seems like the showdowns are filling faster than the night slates are recently. And they're both filling for the most part and definitely more nights than not. But I feel like the night slates have really, or the showdowns rather, have been filling a lot. And I'm curious your thoughts here. I know you're only doing one dummy lineup, but I captain, actually just to make sure this is still correct, but previously it looked like Nikola Jokic was the chalk captain for the Portland-Denver showdown game. I'm just going to refresh this to make sure that's still the case. Yeah. So still Jokic, the highest projected owned captain. Lillard, 23% compared to 34% captain for Jokic on DraftKings. On FanDuel, the MVP spot's also going to be heavy Jokic with Lillard number 2. I've had my bias here. I'm a Damian Lillard guy on the night and really a lot over the last week. I really like Lillard a lot more at captain here, but I feel like there's also some opportunity going to Cantor at single-digit ownership. Jamal Murray, who's been shooting so much more, again, like a 30%-ish usage rate over the last couple of weeks, I feel like is definitely noteworthy to me. I'd rather have any of those three guys, Lillard, Cantor, or Murray, over Jokic at this point. I feel like taking the chalk captain on showdowns is never really the move I want to do. But how do you feel about Jokic as a chalk captain? Would you be more willing to go there than I am?
Yes. And the reason is because there's not that big of a gap between his projected ownership and Lillard's. If there was Jokic 34% projected captain, Lillard 23%. So they're both chalk, right? And if this was a situation, like we see a bunch of showdowns where one guy's 50% projected ownership at captain, like the James Harden slate the other day, and then just everybody else is, like 8% or lower. This isn't that same situation. Jokic and Lillard are kind of on a tier by themselves. And so with that in mind, I prefer Jokic to Lillard. I haven't projected for a lot more fantasy points today. If you want to go with somebody else at the captain spot, I would either go really cheap and then just throw Rodney Hood in there or something, because then you just pay up for everybody else that you want to. If you're going like way off the board, actually, I'm gonna take it back. I'm just because I know this is gonna trigger people, but I also know it's the right answer. Michael Porter Jr. as the low on captain play, because we know the upside's there, right? Eventually he's going to have a good game. This isn't even a thing where it's like he's due or anything like that, because that's, that's like generally nonsense. But I mean, somebody who's only priced at 8,000 for his utility spots at 12,000 at the captain. And that still gives you the flexibility to be able to fit in both Damian Lillard and Nikola Jokic without actually sacrificing upside. Because Michael Porter Jr. really doesn't have the same like 70 fantasy point upside of Lillard and Jokic. He still has enough upside where he could put up a big game in the captain spot, and more upside at least than just throwing a punt guy in there. So that's going to be my real answer. There's Michael Porter Jr.
So I'm actually with you on that. I did put in one lineup with Michael Porter Jr. I did put in one lineup with Will Barton as captain. I agree that Porter Jr. though is the guy. Like, I wouldn't go to a Hood or anybody like that. We actually had, and this one I don't think has been updated to reflect Zeke Nnaji not starting them. Actually, maybe it does, honestly. Zeke Nnaji is going to be one of the actually is going to rank as a captain. He's got me not going to be one of the higher owned, but going to have 2.5% ownership on him at captain, which is just slightly less than Will Barton, slightly less than Gary Trent, slightly less than Michael Porter Jr. I'd much rather have Michael Porter Jr. at captain. I know that's a big price difference, but I think you're going to have better results at playing a captain that actually has the upside to get to 40 fantasy points or even 35 or so. So then you're looking at a 50 fantasy point overall output there, the captain spot on DraftKings. Like Nnaji, his best case scenario really feels like a 15-point day. And then with the bonus, you're still not even cracking 30. Like, I just don't think going to Hood, Nnaji, any of those super cheap guys at captain is the move really ever, but I think especially tonight.
So where I do think it makes sense to play somebody really cheap at captain is where it's a game like, I don't know, the Nets are playing the Lakers or something like that. And then you just have like 4 like superstars to pay up for. And if all of those guys score like 50 to 60 fantasy points, which we've seen happen sometimes, then if you just get a cheap play who scores like 20 fantasy points, then he could end up optimal at captain just because you're able to fit in all those other stars. I thought about that for a second on this slate, but it's not quite star heavy enough. Like, Lillard and Jokic are both great, except you probably need a third real bona fide star for that to make sense. Zeke Nnaji, he is one game all season with more than 18 fantasy points. So it's hard to think that he is any real legitimate upside.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Saz Crib in the premium Slack, one of our regulars on there. And really another important part of the membership is being on that premium Slack, talking to guys like Saz Crib, some of the other regulars on there who are sharp and talking about their ideas all day long and the things they're observing. And Saz saying, you want Porter Jr. at power forward. He was AK chalk in the bubble as power forward. This gives him the chance to get boards playing with lower rebound guys than 2 bigs. Like, I agree. I think, there's really an aversion to MPJ, and we're not, like, I promise you, I'm not touting him to be like, hey, you guys are playing Michael Porter Jr. and I'm just not going to play him. Like, people seem to think that we do when we're on these shows. I'm playing Michael Porter Jr. today because I'm trying to get the buy-in here, especially on a short slate that he does have the potential to have an upside. And I think that's really where I'm willing to stake things. And if Jamal Murray keeps shooting a lot more while he's on the court with Porter, it's not going to be great. But at the same time, I'm kind of willing to take that stab in the hopes that things level out a little bit more. And Porter Jr. is sort of the obvious guy who does have upside, does have the rebounding upside, does have the scoring upside, maybe not the assist upside, but he has all the other things there. And I feel like Porter Jr. to me, it's still, not my highest owned captain. That's Dame, but I do think Porter in the mix for a showdown captain is not crazy at all.
Yep, I agree with you. I said it first, you agreed with me, so I'm going to agree with you agreeing with me.
Look, we're agreeing with each other. We're agreeing with Saz Crib. We're all agreeing here. That's really the main thing, besides YouTube chat, who hates Michael Porter Jr. and possibly wants to burn him at the stake. I don't know. Let's see. We had one question here. Somebody was asking about Nasir Little earlier, and I lost where it was, but Nasir Little is one of those guys to me that people play in showdowns in the hopes that he could spike an upside. And if you're playing an ungodly amount of lineups, I get getting there. But to me, when I'm playing just a shortened amount here, playing less than 10, I didn't really want to get to Nasir Little. I also didn't want to get too much to Isaiah Hartenstein. He was a guy I didn't get to at all. Greg, were there really any guys that you would consider a non-starter at all for even a showdown slate?
So you mean somebody who I would like absolutely take out of the player pool?
Yeah, or at least, really try to make sure you get none of it because people will probably play them more than they should.
So, I mean, now that to bring up something that I've mentioned before, now that we have the guards, now we have Monty Morris starting over Zeke Nnaji, and I'm expecting more small ball. To me, I think that takes Isaiah Hartenstein out of consideration. It takes Bol out of consideration. Not that I think people should be, running to roster Bol, except he has been in the rotation, or at least he was in the rotation last game. He played 12 minutes. So maybe people look at Bol playing 12 minutes last game, and that makes him somebody who they'd want to get to. But now I expect that he's going to get pinched with the Nuggets going smaller in the starting lineup.
Yeah, I think that's fair. The construction here with Monty Morris and RJ Hampton does look pretty good, though. You can get well, I don't want to just give away the lineup that I'm tinkering with here, but you get Lillard, Jokic, Barton, Monty Morris, RJ Hampton, no MPJ, but you can get then Anthony Simons in the last spot. I feel like RJ Hampton could be interesting. I think he's going to be owned because he's 1K flat, and the minutes projection now puts him above Nnaji. So I'm still going to have a good amount of Nnaji, but you can make really nice lineups with RJ Hampton for the showdown.
Yeah, I'm refreshing to look at the latest ownership. And we have Hampton was 19% in the latest run, and Nnaji was 34%. I mean, at least what we have in the latest numbers, Hampton has almost half the ownership, and he's also half the price.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the idea of them playing small does seem to make sense. We also had questions about Mo Wagner. Actually, we'll talk about it in a second. Brian Seymour, Spags and Greg, I appreciate all the work you guys do. It's my third NBA season with Awesemo fan. Let's keep winning. Yeah, I'm glad you're doing well, Brian, and really to everybody else out there. Brian's had some success. A lot of guys out there have had some success, but the best way, whether you want to just try it out or actually dive in head first and pay for one of the bigger packages, we have express packages that are super cheap at awesemo.com/join. We also have obviously the full data packages where you can get every sport. And there are so many sports going on right now. You could do some NASCAR, you could do some MMA, you could do PGA. You don't have to rely NHL. You don't have to rely just on NBA. But go check out the packages at awesemo.com/join because it's helpful, especially for these short slates. Mo Wagner, we haven't talked about at all. He's been starting. I still think I'd rather have Robin Lopez, even though the pathway is there for Wagner to actually have good run. It just doesn't seem like he's ever going to have that great of a day. And maybe that day is today, but it doesn't seem to me like the opportunity is really there for him because he played well yesterday and still didn't get a ton of run there. Still saw a lot of Robin Lopez. But do you have any feel here for Mo Wagner? Would he be a guy you'd consider throwing in a little bit more in the hopes that he does get those starter minutes and actually keeps them?
So Wagner started 5 games this year. He's averaging 15 minutes and 16 fantasy points in those minutes. There was a couple people who I saw were asking in the YouTube chat, do I prefer Mo Wagner or Davis Bertans? To me, it's Bertans because I think there's just much more considerable upside, even though he comes off the bench and Mo Wagner is starting. Bertans is he's playing a lot more minutes. He's playing almost twice as many minutes as what Wagner plays. And there's always just that chance that Bertans catches lightning in a bottle and he makes his shots for one day. I mean, we saw 3 games ago against the Nuggets, he made 9 threes and scored 35 real life points. Davis Bertans has that kind of upside that the Mo Wagner just doesn't have. Wagner is a pretty decent points per minute fantasy producer, but he just doesn't play enough minutes.
Antoine Murphy, fade Dame. How dare you? The nerve of you, Antoine, on this day in which I'm drawing all of my Dame lineups. Look, the argument for Dame, I think, is really simple. Besides his rate jumps recently, where he's looking like the Dame of a year ago, who people thought was gone without CJ McCollum, but now he's back in our lives. 38% usage, 45% assist rate. I think for me, Dame is, I would say, a must play on the late slate, relative to some amount of ownership. Again, if you're playing a bunch there, don't do it. But I would say for me, if you were playing one lineup, I would put Dame in. I'm a very big Dame believer. And we just saw a very comparable guard in Trae Young. Not this is always perfect. DVP isn't a perfect stat by any stretch, but Trae Young just did amazing things against Denver not too far ago. And I think Dame is a much better version of what Trae does. And I think Trae breaks the main slate today. So I very much want to play him on the night slate.
But did you say Dame or Trae?
Dame. I think Dame breaks like the overall main slate,
you
much like Trae did against.
Oh, okay.
Denver.
Okay. Yeah. I misunderstood what you were saying.
You're too hypnotized by my fantastic takes.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to do that, but I'm also trying to read the YouTube and the Slack chat to see if we got any questions last second there. So the only pushback I give is that I think that Jokic is a better pay up option than Dame. That if this was a slate where it's just like, hey, we only have Dame as a pay up option, and then not really other people who are comparable to him, then I would say that I would agree. But I have Jokic project for a lot more fantasy points than Lillard.
Campazzo or Neto, chat in YouTube right now on FanDuel. Do you have a lean between those two? And I'm going to check Alex's projections too to see.
Off the top of my head, it's Campazzo. Let me just double check though, because I mean Neto is somebody who usually needs, it's Campazzo by a pretty wide margin for me. Neto usually needs like Beal or Westbrook to be resting to get bigger minutes. And I guess the case here would be that you think that, hey, maybe the game's a blowout and Neto plays like garbage time minutes. And I guess that's maybe a possibility, but for now, I think we have to expect that Beal and Westbrook play most of the backcourt minutes as long as the game is competitive.
Yeah, Campazzo's role feels a little more secure. I think there is a pathway for Neto to have that day, but then you're banking on the blowout for the most part, and that's for the generally not something you're going to want to do too much unless you're playing a bunch of lineups. So I agree, Campazzo would be the play there. People like Dame Time. Trent Antoine saying, so just in the interest of full representation, Antoine saying Trent Jr. is the Blazer. That's a must play. Okay. I'm playing Trent Jr. I think Trent Jr. is a better play. Actually, no, he's fine for the showdown and the night slate, but I don't know. I'd much rather have Dame. Obviously, though, they're completely different price points. But do you have any feel here for Gary Trent? Greg, do you like him? Do you like Covington? Do you like any of these other Blazers that we haven't hit on?
I don't like Covington, at least on FanDuel, though. Then Trent, if you're playing multiple lineups, Trent is a must play because there's Beal, like we said before, the shooting guard options are Beal, Paul George, Gary Trent, and then the next most expensive shooting guard is Terrence Mann. So on FanDuel, I would agree. If you're playing multiple lineups, yes, you absolutely have to get exposure to Gary Trent. On DraftKings, I think that he looks like a pretty nondescript play. He is priced at, where's Gary Trent? He was, why is he not coming up? Oh, because I can't spell. Because the E comes before the N. 5,900 for Gary Trent. That's a very fair price tag for me. And then 25% ownership also looks about fair to me. So I'd call him a really strong play on FanDuel just because there aren't other options, and then pretty nondescript on DraftKings.
Last question from Ryan in the YouTube chat. Thoughts on Derrick Jones Jr. at captain? It's too late, but I wouldn't play him at captain. Derrick Jones Jr. seems like you're paying a price now for Derrick Jones on games that I think like he's been good. I just don't think he keeps it going here. He's too expensive to me. So I wouldn't play Derrick Jones at captain. I just don't think that's got the upside.
No, you need him to get like his 8 defensive stat game or whatever.
All right, we appreciate all you guys watching. Make sure to follow at G Ehrenberg DFS and follow Chris Spags. And of course, always follow at Awesemo_com. There's giveaways. There's all the content we have going on at any given time. You'll find it all on the at Awesemo_com Twitter handle. Make sure to check out Odd Shopper too. Those ROIs and win percentages are going to be really helpful. They come right from Alex's projections. So you're going to be getting really good data for yourself if you're trying to beat the prop bet markets in your local legal region. So go check those out now. Greg, any other plugs besides that? You will be back here with me tomorrow having a fantastic time swapping and sweating and spitting and sliding and squeezing and squealing.
Yeah, and sucking. Just follow me on Twitter at G Ehrenberg DFS, and that'll be it for me. All
right, we appreciate you guys. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and we'll see you guys again soon. Wish you the best of luck. Bye.